Hello, my name is Stefan Couperus. I am a political historian at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, where I teach political science and political history in a European Studies program. And this month I have been a research fellow at the Project House Europe and the Rachel Carson Center. And it's my genuine pleasure to present my work in progress today at the RCC Lunch Colloquium. And many thanks to the RCC for offering me this opportunity, and I'm looking forward very much to the Q&A. Now, this presentation tries to explain the main idea behind a research proposal that I started working on recently, and it is a preliminary entitled Grey Democracy for a Green Future? ? So in the next few minutes I will explain what I mean by this and what explains the subtitle of this presentation, Environmentalism and the Social Imaginary of Democracy in Western Europe 1970-2000. In essence, this project deals with the relationship between democracy and environmentalism in Western Europe in the period 1970-2000. It revolves around the larger question of why a particular understanding and practice of democracy seems to have solidified in post-war Western Europe, despite societal challenges that urged for democratic change and innovation, such as the burgeoning environmental problems of the 20th century. Now, there is a rich scholarly and public discourse about post-war Western democracy that frames it as the golden age of democratic politics, that is entangled with the so-called Trente Glorieuses in French, or the Wirtschaftswunder in German. Let's say the period of unprecedented economic growth across Western Europe. Now, this particular understanding of democracy, which I will call grey democracy, has been very influential in structuring and shaping environmental politics since the 1970s, thereby cutting off a host of alternatives despite heightened awareness of environmental problems and climate change throughout the same period. Moreover, grey democracy still resonates in various debates about rethinking democratic practice today, without giving account of its entanglement with the natural resource-driven economic growth, and thus the highly idiosyncratic and contingent conditions under which it materialized. Now, this research project thus wants to understand and explain why and how the persistent resonance of grey democracy shaped institutional environmental politics in Western Europe after 1970. So if we want to understand why democratic systems and politics have only fairly recently adhered to the more fundamental agendas of change, we need to revisit the dynamics between democracy and environmentalism in institutionalized politics and policymaking in the past. Now, key to approaching this question is the notion of the social imaginary in relation to democracy and the natural environment. And in the next few minutes, I will expound on the preliminary premises and elements that inform this project. And by the end, I will give a brief example of what this approach might yield. So the vantage point of this research project is the so-called convergence of democracy into a more or less similar way of doing democracy in Western Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, mostly referring to France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries here. Now, these two excellent recent studies by Martin Conway on the left-hand side and Pepe Corduweiner on the right-hand side explain how, after a period of uncertainty in the late 1940s, a common acceptance emerged in the 1950s about what democratic politics entailed. Newly established broad people's parties, mostly Christian democratic or social democratic ones, coalesced their understandings of democracy so that its interpretation became decontested and shared across the board. This particular understanding of democracy amounted to what scholars have called a controlled, consensual, and limited democracy. This basically means that democracy was not about instilling sovereignty into the people, other than accepting universal suffrage. Rather, it entailed, according to Martin Conway, and I quote, national and local elections conducted under a very simple principle of one vote per citizen, who, assembled in parliaments and council chambers in Europe, voted on projects of legislation proposed by governments, composed of the elected representatives of one or generally more political broad people's parties. Now, to these tenets was then added, mostly in the social economic realm, a host of intermediary bodies comprising interest groups, trade unions, and employers' organizations, and representatives of the states, to promote policy consultation and consensualism. Now, this is only a somewhat simplified version of the institutional makeup of the post-war democratic model in Western Europe. For the people, though not all the people, as the working classes did not always benefit, this model of democracy offered a new social contract that embodied a democracy that delivered, and people could find feasible benefits within. Democracy, thus, was not about fleshing out popular sovereignty or expressing conflicting opinions in public, but it was a project that had to be first and foremost controlled, managed, and safe, by means of creating intermediaries between the state and the people. Now, this configuration produced a set of management techniques propelling material prosperity and economic growth, fueled by natural resource-driven industrial production. And it worked on these terms. All countries in Western Europe witnessed enormous economic growth and increase in affluence and prosperity, usually subsumed under terms such as Les 30 Glorieuses in France, the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany, or the boom economico in Italy, as we see here on the slide. Now, quite telling for this development is a section from Tony Judd's famous Post-War, where he shares the percentages of fridge ownership in 1974. So whereas electrified fridges were mostly absent from Western European households in the early 1950s still, most people owned one some 2 decades later. So refrigerators, cars, television sets, kitchens came to symbolize the new affluence of Western Europe under the aegis of controlled democracy. So in my project in the making, I refer to this constellation of the 1950s and 1960s as grey democracy, being controlled consensual democracy mediated by intermediaries geared towards natural resource-driven economic growth, prosperity, and political stability. And this particular understanding of democracy has been, and still is, very influential in political and intellectual discourse and thought, and is frequently referred to as, for instance, the democratic moment of Western Europe, the golden age of European democracy, or even as a guideline to reconsider the workings of democracy today. So why the adjective grey then in grey democracy? Now, what seems to be missing in political scholarship and public discourse about post-war democracy in Western Europe is its coincidence and intertwinement with what environmental scholars like McNeill and Engelke, here on the left-hand side, have called the Great Acceleration. So here we see on the right-hand side how from the 1950s onwards, similar upward trends apply to the population, the GDP, consumerism, but also to carbon emissions, floods, species extinction, and so forth. Now, this is to make the argument that the emergence of post-war democracy and its preoccupation with economic growth cannot be seen separately from the Great Acceleration and the detrimental effects on the natural environment of exponential industrial carbon-driven growth. In other words, if we today, and in the recent past, have widely accepted the environmental and climate crises, and if we want our democratic systems to act more than they do now, why are Western European countries still so much involved with a democratic model that fostered, if not facilitated, an organization of the economy and of society that's probably part of the problem? This becomes all the more salient if we look at how heightened awareness and knowledge of environmental concerns have been around in Western Europe for a long time already, culminating in a political opportunity structure in the early 1970s, when grassroots and transnational environmental movements, influential publications such as The Limits to Growth, and the UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 in Stockholm seem to have found inroads into institutional politics and policy making. And indeed, as a result of the so-called ecological revolution, the early 1970s witnessed a host of new governmental agencies in France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, which started working on new environmental policies and regulation, some of which were successful in, for instance, reducing water and air pollution. However, If we look closer at what happened in national and also supranational institutional politics and policy making, we cannot but conclude that there is a disjuncture between what modern environmentalism conveyed about the state of the environment and what was ultimately done in terms of far-reaching institutional and political change. Particularly when you look further into the 1980s and 1990s, you see a readaptation of the economic growth paradigm, combined with a solutionist approach to separate environmental issues. What seems to be at play here is a continuous clash between, on the one hand, grey democracy and modern environmentalism, envisioning a green future on the other hand. So for the ruling elites, maintaining grey democracy, economic growth, and controlled democracy remained the logic with which a so-called green future could be aspired for. Whereas counter voices saw this model of democracy, here represented as a coffin carried away by German activists in the 70s, they saw democracy as a problem of engaging with environmental problems in a more systemic way. So this brings me then to my broader research puzzle. So there was already heightened awareness of knowledge of the effects on the environment of industrial capitalism at large, particularly in the 1970s. But why then did democratic politics produce, in hindsight, so little in terms of systematically addressing environmental problems? Now, there is historical and social science scholarship that has engaged with this question, normatively and analytically. And the offered explanations mostly revolve around interpretations of the complexity of post-war politics and society, making it hard to change things in the first place, so sticky institutions, or they stress the power of carbon-driven industries and conclude that environmental issues were not among the most pressing challenges in the course of the 20th century. Now, all these explanations have their own merit, obviously, but they do not tell us much about the deeper modes of understanding at the intersection of democratic politics and environmental problems. And I believe that the notion of the social imaginary might help us to gain new insights into the disjuncture between what I call grey democracy and modern environmentalism. Now, this is not to say that we should read today's environmental concerns into the recent past, but rather it argues that in order to understand the relationship between institutionalized democratic politics and environmental politics since the 1970s in Western Europe, we need to account for the zeitgeist and historical context within which modern environmentalism resonated. Now, the notion of the social imaginary, which I will be using for this project, has a multifarious genealogy with distinct trajectories in psychoanalysis, political philosophy, and social and cultural theory. Now, ignoring the ontological and epistemological debates about the nature and workings of the social imaginary for now, political and historical scholarship has largely followed definitions that amount to seeing social imaginaries, and I quote, as deep-seated modes of understanding that provide largely pre-reflexive parameters within which people imagine their existence, end of quote. Now, if we move from this general definition to a more political interpretation of the imaginary, two tentative observations are worth sharing here. First, and following Charles Taylor's seminal work on the social imaginary, the concept of the political imaginary offers an interesting avenue for researching how political principles are shared and how political institutions are legitimized. In other words, how it generates common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. Secondly, recent scholarship has suggested that the political imaginary approach enables us to critically address particular contradictions and conflicting temporal horizons in Western democracies. Now, this offers an interesting perspective when it comes to the role of the natural environment in democratic politics. If we see potential in investigating how a particular hegemonic political imaginary operates in shaping environmental politics since the Great Acceleration in Western Europe, we need to find instances when and where the so-called pre-reflexive parameters of grey democracy are acted out in political discourse. Ergo, such an approach is concerned with tracing the semiotic and discursive liaisons and contrasts between grey democracy and a green future at certain moments of contention. By looking at how the political imaginary of grey democracy was confronted with counter or other social imaginaries at moments of contention, we might be able to better understand how, for instance, a more radical democratic imaginary and an emerging ecological imaginary intersect and contend with grey democracy, and how subsequently the imaginary of grey democracy loses maybe some of its traction, or might even change, or not. Now, taking cue from the political imaginary approach, we can now translate the broader research puzzle about the post-war junction between democracy and environmental concerns in Western Europe into the following preliminary research question. Why and how did the social imaginary of grey democracy, based on the experiences of the mid-20th century great acceleration, shape and possibly limited environmental politics since the 1970s until the turn of the century? Now, I would like to conclude this presentation with a very short example that might give a bit more clarity to what I'm trying to get at here. And here I take the Netherlands as a case study, as I have been able to look into a few Dutch sources already. Now, taking the early 1970s again as a moment of contention where grey democracy was confronted with heightened knowledge and awareness about the condition of the national environment, the Netherlands, like Germany, France and Italy, also established new state departments and parliamentary committees involved in environmental policies. Now, at the inaugural meeting of the Dutch Environmental Parliamentary Committee in 1973, overseeing new environmental policy making, the conservative Catholic Member of Parliament, Berthe Groensmit, shared her concerns after having read The Limits to Growth, the report of the Club of Rome from 1972. And in a long and emotional speech, she gave account of the severeness of what was at stake. And I cite her: "We only have one Earth. The advancing environmental pollution is a global time bomb, of which the date of explosion is unknown. The environmental crisis is closely related to a severe mental impurity, denial of the laws of nature, and the exploitation of nature and fellow man. We shall need a different vision on progress than hitherto. There is drastic need for a policy vision." End of quote. Now, most of the other MPs in the meeting, from all sorts of different ideological backgrounds, seemed to endorse her outcry. But after all speakers had shared their deep concerns about the environment, something remarkable happened. The turgid language about environmental pollution and the shared responsibility to do something about it was superseded by something entirely different. Instead of continuing to discuss what sort of visions and changes were necessary, all MPs resorted to a tested vocabulary of solutionism, or in German, politische Lösungsdenken. Their environmentalism was reduced to delineating a number of concrete issues, such as water pollution, that had to be attributed to existing bodies of government. And so it happened that not the problems as such were discussed any further, but that a lengthy debate emerged about which governmental actors and layers should do exactly what, and what not, and to what extent. So the same conservative MP, Berthe Groensmit, for instance, then said, and I quote her again, "The central state should be responsible for polluted surface water, when it concerns state waters, that is. The remaining responsibility rests with the provincial authorities, who are allowed to delegate their responsibilities in turn." End of quote. Now, another MP, the progressive liberal Jan Terlouw, acknowledged the deeper causes of environmental pollution, namely the political and economic structures of the time, but in the same breath stoically stated, and I quote him, "We need to deal with the current structures to protect the environment." End of quote. Now, this was the kind of approach that rooted, I argue, in the imaginary of grey democracy, where societal problems had to be reduced to depoliticized technical matters that could be solved quickly, at the service of continuing political stability and economic growth. The emerging ecological imaginary stemming from modern environmentalism, thus, did not remain unnoticed in the centers of political decision-making. Yet it was countered, and maybe even usurped, by the persistent and resilient understanding of what democratic politics was ultimately about: protect stability, promote economic growth, and solve the problems that are in its way. Now, I hope this brief example and this presentation have given you a glimpse into the main ideas that will inform this project in the making. In terms of research design, it will engage with at least 3 moments of contention, where grey democracy, as I call it, was confronted with or possibly permeated by environmentalism: the early 70s, the mid-1980s, and the mid-1990s. I will look into national case studies in Western European countries, also taking into account the supranational developments of European integration and globalization. And I'll do so in a comparative way, hoping to find certain variations of the persistence of grey democracy in environmental politics and the conditions under which the imaginary of grey democracy changed or maybe lost some of its traction. This is not to say that this is all set in stone, obviously. I'm still very much open to all sorts of changes and suggestions. But these are at present the main outlines of my project. Thank you for listening and looking forward to the discussion.